Great. Is that everyone? Okay. Thank you. And welcome to this evening's event. My name is Pippa Goldfinger, and I'm Head of Design at Design West. We're a charity for design and placemaking, and our mission is to inspire the public, politicians and professionals across the built environment to design better, healthier places to live, work and relax. Our activities include monthly public talks like this, Bristol Open Doors, and our Shape My City education programme for young people. We also carry out design review across the west of England and increasingly into the southwest. It's lovely to see you in person. We're having to rebuild our audiences post-COVID, so we're really happy that you decided to come on out and to a live event. And do look out for future events, because we do have regular monthly talks and even some smaller talks in our own building. So you may have noticed the coral pink scooters that have appeared around the city and the red and white e-bikes that have also emerged recently. As so much is happening in Bristol, we thought it was a good moment to take stock of the impact of these new modes of transport and how they interact with a city designed around the car. We're very lucky to be joined by three experts in this field. We have Dr. Kiran Chatterjee, who's the Professor of Travel Behaviour and member of the Centre for Transport and Society at UE Bristol. Zoe Banks-Gross, who's the Head of Partnerships and Public Policy, is that right, at Sustrans, and we have Sam Pooke, who's Head of Policy at VOI. We'll have the three presentations from our experts, and then we'll have a panel discussion where we'll be joined by Bristol City Council Cabinet Lead for Transport, Councillor Donald Alexander. So if you could hold on to your questions to that part of the evening. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Kiran Chatterjee is Professor of Travel Behaviour and member of the Centre for Transport and Society at UE Bristol. His research seeks to understand the way in which people travel and how transport systems and social, economic and technological change influence behaviour. He also seeks to identify how people's access to transport and use of transport affects their life opportunities and well-being. He led the influential evidence review for the Department for Transport, published in 2018, on reasons for the decline in car driving of young people, and recently chaired an International Transport Forum working group which reported on travel transitions, how transport planners and policymakers can respond to shifting mobility trends. So, without tripping over that awkward board at the front, Kiran, could you join us? Thank you. Please welcome Kiran.
As Pippa introduced, I don't focus my research so much on transport disruptors, but rather the whole transport landscape and the effect of wider social change. And I'm going to say that there are some more important disruptors from outside transport than within transport. That we need to pay attention, and we need to pay attention to the traditional transport alternatives more than ever before, actually. However, I don't want to put a dampener on exciting new transport technological opportunities, so I'll explain that I think they have a really pivotal role as well. My aim is to provide context to our deliberations over transport disruptors. I don't think travel trends over the last 20 years are that well understood. And I want to shed light on those, and I'll then consider what has happened since COVID, and I'll finish by looking and giving my personal reflections on what lies ahead of us. I'm mostly going to look at things from a national level rather than a local level, looking at things from a Great Britain or England perspective, but I'll take a quick look at Bristol along the way. And first I'd like to do a little straw poll. I want to find out what your perceptions are about the change in car driving in the last 20 years, or up to 2019 at least, from 2000 to 2019. Do you think driving we are driving more, less, or about the same. So I know it's a bit dark, but I'd like to just get an impression of your perceptions of whether, first of all, whether you think we're driving more. There's quite a lot there. Driving less. Slightly fewer numbers on that one, and driving about the same. It's quite evenly split. I think a few more of you perhaps thinking we're driving more. I'll come back. You'll soon hear the answer to that one. This is a long-term picture for personal travel since 1960, suggesting incessant growth in car van travel, though it's levelled off to some extent in the 2000s before growing again around about 2015. And you can just about on this make out that bus use has been declining, and it's the orange, and rail use, the slightly browner colour there, rail use has been increasing, but they're making up a small proportion of the total picture. And this is travel distance. It doesn't capture what's going on in terms of shorter local trips, as they end up making a small proportion of total distance, but still very important to our lives and environments. So that's one perspective on what's happening to travel and car travel. This is looking at total travel, or by all modes. And while overall travel has been growing, we saw in the previous slide, so has the size of the population. And actually the size of the population has been growing at a greater rate than the rate of overall travel. So travel per person, as you can see here, has actually been declining the last 20 years. It's around about 10% lower for both the trips and distance. And to get to the answer to perhaps to the straw poll, here's another chart, this time showing travel by mode of transport in terms of trips we make. And we can see here that there are decreases over that period for the use of virtually all of those main transport modes, only exception there being rail. So yeah, car travel has been declining per person at a per person level quite sharply, really. It's about 10% or so over that period. So the main phenomenon really over the last 20 years has been not really a shift in the way we travel. It has been decreased travel. But there are some interesting sub-phenomena to that. And the work that I did for the International Transport Forum recently on travel transitions, I had a look at counter trends that are explaining the phenomenon where car travel has been decreasing. So I looked at, and these are a list of 10 counter trends that I picked out from looking at the data and the trends. I could talk about all 10 of these, but I'll spare you that, and I'll focus on two of those. Particularly the car driving of young adults and the growth in shared mobility users. In 2018, Pippa mentioned this, in 2018 a team of us at UWE, at the Centre for Transport Society at UWE, and from the University of Oxford, we published a report for the Department of Transport on young people's travel. The young people's decrease in travel had taken a while to be really picked up, noticed, but it actually, the trend started in the mid-1990s, and eventually this prompted the Department of Transport to commission the study that we undertook. We gathered data and explored the reasons for underlying the trends in the data. From the data, we showed that we've witnessed a situation where each successive generation of young people has been driving less than the previous one, and this has started from those born in the late 1970s. So a bit. I suppose I was in about the peak group for young people learning to drive and driving, and after my birth cohort, it's been slowly and gradually declining over time, particularly for men, as you can see there on the left. Bit less. It's less it's much smaller difference for women, but what we're seeing then, particularly then for men, is this decrease for each generation. And we're also seeing that it's not just a case of them starting their adult lives in that way, but it follows on. So as young people move into their 30s, they're not catching up and driving the same as the previous 30-year-olds. They're still remaining with a lower car use. We were focusing really mainly on trying to explain this phenomenon, and we looked at around 20 different factors, mostly outside of transport. These factors, and we concluded that it was a real combination of most of them that was to explaining these trends. So you can see here it's about employment, how that's changed. It's about extended periods in higher education. It's about demographic change, young people having children later in their lives. It's about where people live, young people in particular living more in urban areas. And then with transport itself, the cost of driving has been increasing, and the cost of transport in general, actually the cost of public transport is increasing at a faster rate than driving. It's actually probably more, though, other living costs that have been playing a role, particularly housing, which is making transport less affordable for young people. There's also less face-to-face interaction required. This report was pre-pandemic, but we're still identifying the role of that, digital technology and communication. And young people spending more time at home, which data shows quite significantly more time they're spending at home. And cars are no longer seen quite as aspirational amongst the whole group of young people as they once were. Where does this leave us? A consequence of this lower amount of driving is that buses play a really important role, especially for 16, 20 to 24-year-olds, as you can see here, where around 40% of that age group are using buses often. So that's going to be a theme I'm going to return to, the importance of traditional transport options. I also want to mention about one of the other counter trends is in the use of shared mobility users, growth in shared mobility users. This has been quite modest, though, I'd say. The growth in options across the spectrum of types of shared mobility, when it's shown with this diagram, it's distinguishing those over the short distances, such as e-scooters, e-bike, shared bikes, medium distance, ride-hailing, long distance, car clubs, for example. And these aren't really very new. They've been around since about the late 90s. We've seen an increasing number of services and users, but those users remain quite concentrated amongst, perhaps as a niche option used by particularly those in London, big cities, particularly amongst younger, middle-aged, higher income men. And the data, the statistics, tend to show a very small share of total travel can be captured by these options. At least that was a picture in 2019. I want to say something specifically about Bristol. It's there's no definitive data on mode share at the level of the city of Bristol, and the best estimates suggest, are shown there, suggesting car use make up about half of all journeys, public transport about 20%, cycling 10%, walking 30%. And you can see the trends there. Car use pretty stable, but quite impressive growth in bus use, and that's not the same in other parts of the country. Most other parts of the country have seen a decline. So a positive story in Bristol about bus growth, not right since 2000, but in around about 2010 and 5 or so year period. And longer term than that has been the increase in cycling volumes over time. I would caveat that and say that both of those, bus and cycle use, bus use particularly, relatively low for a large city in England. So they're starting from a relatively low base, which so it's a bit easier to grow from a low base. So that a little bit about the Bristol picture. But I want to move on to now what's happened in the last 2 years. And Yeah, we hear quite a lot about this in the media. Car traffic is, there's some stories that car traffic has returned to pre-pandemic levels, and it's accelerating away as people are scared of using public transport. But that's not really quite the case. You can see from the green line here, public transport is still it's less than 100%. It's lower than it was pre-pandemic for weekdays. So it's not. Well, so it's a positive story in terms of many of the impacts associated with car use. Weekends, we see a slightly different story in recent months, where that has been about the same as it was pre-pandemic, even a bit higher. Public transport, though, has not recovered, and this rail and bus both, they're below 80% of the levels they were pre-pandemic. And this, perhaps, is a major worry. It's as I'll talk about later. There's some opportunities the government are putting in place policies to support the building back better with public transport. But this lack of return of people to public transport is compromising. Well, as well as some say, as I'll say later, government funding is perhaps compromising the potential for public transport to help build back better. So now I'll say a little bit about disruptors, transport disruptors, e-scooters, and I hope it's okay for Sam here. I'm mentioning a few statistics which are not actually in the public domain yet, but I hope that's okay. I think they're positive stories about Voi's operation in the west of England. The west of England, as Sam reminded me earlier, is now for Voi at least, it's got the largest market in Europe for their operations, and it's certainly the largest scheme in England. So the pilot trials for e-scooters were started in the first few months of the pandemic, partly in response to the concerns about social distancing needs and public transport not being really very suitable for use for many people, so needing an alternative. And e-scooter pilot trials the pilots were rapidly rolled out, or rapidly enabled, and we got to the position now in recent months where about 10,000 rides, it's actually more than that per day, slightly more than that now, in Bristol specifically. And my quick estimation suggests that must be about 1% of all journeys in the Bristol area. So it's a big number, but it has a particularly important role in certain parts of the city, like the city centre. But it is only 1% of about 1% of all journeys, and that's still a lot lower than say cycling, which is estimated to be about 10%. But then of those journeys, the data indicates that about 60% of e-scooter rides are replacing public transport or active travel. 25% are replacing car trips. 12% replacing taxi trips. And a small percentage are replacing trips that wouldn't have been made otherwise. So there is a concern there that e-scooters are potentially compromising other sustainable transport modes, cannibalising, if you like, the sustainable transport mode market, and perhaps contributing to threatening bus services, physically active travel, and safe streets environments, if you put a negative spin on it. On the other hand, they could be helping to expand the overall market for sustainable transport options, offering that first-last mile option. And particularly amongst young people who are the major users of e-scooters, they could be providing access to destinations and opportunities that they wouldn't be able to access otherwise. So I think there's many other issues as well. There's certainly both sides of this disruptor to consider. I want to also think about a very different disruptor, and that's low traffic neighbourhoods. Many of which were introduced as a COVID emergency response measure. Impacts are difficult to assess, but one study has tried to grapple with that and suggests that emergency LTNs set up during COVID, and also the longer standing ones, and these are in London, those saw larger increases in active travel in those areas than was happening in non-LTN areas. So they're playing a positive role in increasing active travels. We need more strong further evidence to sort of see the long-term effects of those, but that's promising. And one more disruptor, and it's not really a transport disruptor, and this is the disruption to our working lives from working at home during the pandemic. Well, actually, it was a trend that was working from home was slowly, gradually increasing over time pre-pandemic. We've seen a big increase in working from home for the pandemic. This is just one chart to illustrate that, and it shows around about 11% of people had always been working from home, had been working from home before the pandemic, and were continuing to do during the pandemic. But around a third of the working population were newly started people working at home, whilst there's only 1% going the other direction, moving away from working home to working in the office or factory, as it says there. So a big net move in the direction of working at home, as we'd all expect intuitively realise. And whilst that isn't as stark as it was in June 2020 now, it's still a legacy we have with us. And I'm now going to look ahead to the future, finish off there. I want to start to do that by looking at some promising policy directions. We all like to, many of us love to criticise the government for many different reasons, with plenty of opportunity. But I think in this case there are some positive policy developments which do stem from national government. We've got the gear change vision for half of all journeys in towns and cities on foot or bicycle. We've got bus back better, the reform of bus services, put them under public direction. We've got William Shapp's plan for rail, return to a publicly run rail, or at least publicly directed rail network. And we then have the decarbonising transport plan, which I'm a bit less positive about, but it has a major focus on electrifying transport, perhaps too much focus, but it also does set out the desire, or the vision for reducing urban traffic, consistent with gear change and bus back better. I would say with bus back better, it's now threatened by not having as much funding from the government to match the promises, aspirations of that strategy. West of England last week, who's announced, got 105 million for their bus service improvement plan. Good news, but it's dedicated, and it can only be used for certain objectives relating to what the government wants, reducing fares, more frequent services on high frequency routes. So at the same hand we have this happening, and on the other hand we've got this week, I think, the start of bus service reductions, particularly by First Bus, because they don't have the passengers, they don't have the drivers to operate some of those services. So that's going in the wrong direction, whilst we've got this extra money in, and kind of a net effect of that is unclear. But apart from policy steer, I think we need more than that. I think we need a shift in our mindsets in planning, transport planning, wider planning. We need particularly regarding transport, we need a change in most mindset away from the traditional approach of accommodating mobility growth, focusing on increased mobility needs, and instead of focus, myself and many in the other colleagues of mine in the transport planning profession would advocate a focus more on transport serving a role of enhancing accessibility. So moving our mindset from mobility itself to accessibility. Noting that accessibility can be achieved not only through mobility, which is only one of the three legs of the stool here, it can also be achieved by the land use system, providing opportunities near where people are, and it can also be provided, as we clearly have seen from the pandemic, by telecommunications options where people can get access to certain opportunities without leaving their homes. So between those three different legs of the stool, if you like, there is that overall opportunity to support people's accessibility. We don't need to rely so much on physical mobility as we might have thought, and I don't think the transport planning is quite really grasped that. So myself and colleagues are working in this area on projects, activity relating to this, moving away from predict and provide to a kind of a decide and provide approach, which focuses on accessibility rather than mobility. So that's, I think, something to think about. My conclusions are as follows, really. Personal sort of reflections. Gradual transitions have happened to travel, and they have been happening for 20 years, and they've been accentuated by the pandemic, but they're not new. Reduced travel is the most important feature, and young people are the group most affected. The most important disruptors that have led to that lie outside of transport. But the traditional alternatives to the car, walk, bike, bus and rail, are key to a low carbon transport system, which meets our climate change needs, provides access to the opportunities that everyone needs, and provides the quality of life, the living environments that we also need. Transport disruptors, though, do I think have an important role here. In this, they may hardly be evident in total travel statistics, but they can be complementary to those traditional transport options and can help facilitate change towards that vision if we play our cards right. And I'll finish there.
Thank you, Kieran. Food for thought there. I'd now like to welcome our second speaker, Zoe Banks-Gross. Zoe is Head of Partnerships and Public Affairs, got it right this time, for the South of England at Sustrans. She's passionate about social justice, sustainability and public health. She started her career as a fisheries biologist in the Pacific Northwest and has since worked in Germany and the UK as an environmental scientist, ecologist, translator, community engagement manager, physical activity instructor and personal trainer. Feel exhausted already. She is non-executive director of Playing Out. In 2014, she founded East Bristol Kidical Mass and began teaching women and kids to cycle. Please join me in welcoming Zoe Banks-Gross.
Thank you, Pippa, and thank you everyone that's here. This is the first time I've actually been in person at an event in the last 2 years, so it's really fantastic to not be just on a two-dimensional screen for a change. I'm going to talk about shaping our future cities for everyone. We're talking about transport disruption this evening. So we're talking about city transport design. For whom? Are these guys on the slide, is this who people have in mind when they're planning motorways, when they're planning e-scooters, other things? I think we need to be mindful that when we plan our cities, we need to be planning for everyone, and that includes young people and maybe the people that were not necessarily in this room or in a lot of the rooms where the transport decisions have been made. So what if our cities looked like the future? This is the future which I recall seeing as a child on children's TV. People didn't walk in the future, they were flying around. And they were in these magical kind of bubbles, and even the dog is not walking on the ground. He's also in his own little bubble. One of the things that does seem a bit consistent is the teenager is on a mobile phone, which was predicted 60 years ago. But yeah, looking outside nowadays, we're not seeing people flying around, but we are seeing people often encased in bubbles of plastic and metal. So some things may have come to pass. But what about looking to the past? This is actually from the 1930s, I believe, and this is a street that's closed for children to play, and they've actually got some space outside. So maybe when we're thinking about the transport of our future, we need to be thinking in a really holistic way, and thinking about making sure that everyone can move around our cities equally, and we're not just planning for certain people. In the 19th century, a lot of the transport was planned for rail, and again it was planned for men commuting to work. In the 20th century, again, planning for men to commute to work using cars, but we need to be looking at more than that for the 21st century. So inclusive design for the future should be addressing social justice, as well as health, public health, and the climate emergency. So when we talk about social justice, we're talking about women and disadvantaged people and children, and looking at how we can make sure that our design is actually taking that into consideration. So what I've got up here is from The Conversation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's accessible data and research that's published online. And in the UK, women, young and older people, those from minority communities and disabled people, are concentrated usually in the lowest income communities. And these households usually don't have a car. In contrast to that, nearly 90% of the highest income households own at least one car. And when we think about Bristol, we know that in a number of wards in Bristol, most people do not own cars, yet cars are the ones going through those wards, creating really poor air quality. So it's thinking again about, how can we be equitable in the way that we're designing our cities or potentially retrofitting them. I'm thinking also about children and how are children getting around our cities. The information here around Finland, at age 7, most children, they can already travel to most places within walking distance by themselves. At 8, a lot of them are crossing main roads, and they're going to and from school by themselves, and also after dark alone. I mean, in the UK, a lot of women aren't walking around after dark, but in Finland, 8-year-olds are. In England, most kids aren't walking around alone until they're about 11, and I think we've got this in the Walking for Everyone report, which Sustrans, Arup and Living Streets put together. It was published in March this year. Less than 40% of children age 14 are even allowed to go out after dark. So there's some really big changes that we know are possible. Other countries are doing this, but we need to be considering, how can we do this? How can we do this in this country? How can we do it in Bristol? Let's make our city something not just for older people to access, but for young people as well. Looking at travel patterns, men and women actually travel quite differently. So women do a lot more trip chaining, and that's what this diagram is from Tim Gill's Urban Playground book. And essentially, we are frequently the ones that are carers or making a lot of encumbered trips, including trips with our children, or potentially caring for older people, more trips for shopping and doing a school run, lots of multi-stop, multi-mode trips as well. Women usually use public transport more than men, and if they are using public transport, they're usually using buses as opposed to men who are more likely to be using rail. And women are less likely to walk at night, and I think we've seen some really, really good reasons why, unfortunately, women don't feel confident and comfortable walking around at night. So we need to address these things in the way that our cities are designed or, again, retrofitted. How can we make things safer? How can we create better lit areas? How can we look at making our city a bit more, whether it's dynamic as far as what's happening in the environment, whether it's more inviting, but it should be something that everyone feels comfortable and confident using. Again, looking at children. Children and young people need safe, stimulating routes to get to and from school and around their neighbourhoods. This is an example from Frogmarsh in East Bristol. And again, this is really close to a school, and it's an area that children can actually utilise and play, but it's also a really great area for adults. It's also got some seating so that if you need to stop, a lot of older people or even young new parents need to stop and rest with young children, but it's thinking about how can we design places like this into our city and make our city a bit more attractive and usable and useful for young people as well. Another aspect of social justice is taking into account how disabled people can get around. So I've got a quote from Kate Davis, who's written a book called Handy Woman, and it's actually not really about transport. It's about the fact that she had a stroke when she was 36 years old, and it turned her life upside down. One of the things that helped her recover from her stroke was an implement that was designed in Sweden. So just read the quote from the book, talking about basically the contrast in Sweden and the UK. But Sweden, she's praising because their values are of a national public sphere where the idea of improving everyday life for those with differing physical needs is regarded not as utopian or unachievable, but as an issue of paramount pressing importance. A public sphere which knows that design necessarily contributes to such changes, that urban landscapes, built environments, domestic spaces, everyday tools and objects all have to be radically transformed. And I think you can see this picture's from a walkability report from 2019. We did a walk in East Bristol. You can see this woman's in a mobility scooter, and you can see she's got to get off of the pavement because the pavement's been obstructed. And it's not even easy to get on and off the pavement. It's really difficult because even the pavements don't have consistent drop curbs. So we really need to be changing the way that our cities are designed to make them easily usable, and it's easy to move around, whether you're in a mobility scooter or wheelchair or you have any other issues. It shouldn't be a blockage just to get out of the house and go somewhere. It should be something that we're all thinking about. How can we make this accessible for everyone? We also need to be thinking about health in the way that we're designing our cities. We often talk about exercise, but really what we should be doing is talking about movement. Incidental physical activity is a way that many of us could improve our health. Peter Walker wrote a book called The Miracle Pill, and I believe it's £2.1 billion every year that's going to type 2 diabetes. And it's over £7 billion per year, which are not the direct impacts, but indirect impacts of that, which are amputations and people becoming blind from diabetes. So if you can just imagine, that's a very high amount of money. I think it's one in 6 people in the UK getting type 2 diabetes. But it's also, I think, some ridiculously low number of people that have actually done a 10-minute brisk walk in between the ages of 40 and 60. So there's something fundamentally wrong when people aren't walking around using the environment just to get from point A to point B. The pictures I've got on the slide, the top one is from Falkirk in Scotland, and this is near the Helix and the Wheel Park. And this is near a play park, but actually I saw loads of adults going through this helix as well. I mean, it just compelled people to walk through it. So some recent research came out around how we need to be designing the public sphere to actually have a bit more variability because our bone density is decreasing. And this is not just, women being more likely to get osteoporosis, but it's because most of the designs of our public sphere, when we're making things accessible, we're not just thinking about making them flat and completely boring. Our bodies were designed to be outside, moving around varied terrain. So if you've got to climb over something or move, if you can walk, getting through hoops like this is going to increase your bone density as opposed to just a flat surface. The lower photos from Oslo, and this is a play park, and it's adjacent to a fish ladder, and they've incorporated some elements of the fish ladder into the play park. But again, this is something that compelled not only children but also adults to use the space. So it's thinking about how do we get people into spaces, using spaces, and moving around. And if we have a compelling environment, people are going to be utilizing that space and moving around a lot more than they would if it's just, a boring pavement, which may not even be accessible because it's covered in cars or rubbish bins or who knows what. And another reason why people should be getting out and moving around is their mental well-being. So in Florence Williams' Nature Fix, she cited quite striking numbers of health improvements and mental health improvements just from physical activity. But if you can combine that with green infrastructure, you're basically going to really massively increase that. So thinking again about how we get people moving around, it's not only going to be good for their physical health, but it's going to be good for the mental health as well. I've also mentioned Vision Zero on this slide. Sweden implemented this in 1997. The idea with Vision Zero is that instead of accepting that it's normal for cars to kill or seriously injure people, especially children, the idea is to not have any deaths or serious injuries. And Bristol is one of the first cities that actually implemented this, and it's called safe road system safety strategy, which Adrian Davis from Bristol Health Partners recently wrote a review of where that's at with best practices, and he's laid out 8 ways to improve this in Bristol. But actually, we really need to be working towards this. If we want this to happen, we need to be looking at how can we make our streets safe, especially for children, so that they're not going to be injured and very detrimentally by cars. And again, the climate emergency. This is another area in which we really need to be thinking about redesigning our city. So this slide has a number of modes of transport. It's from the Good to Go, assessing environmental performance of new mobility from the International Transport Forum. And you can see, I hope you can see on the slide, we've got a number of different types of transport and the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. They've got bicycles, where I've got the Aero private bike, no surprise, it's the lowest, but they haven't, for some reason, got walking on there. I would probably hazard to say that that's the lowest form of carbon transport. They also don't have e-cargo bikes. But when we think about these new forms of transport, we should be thinking about the life cycle assessment. The climate emergency is upon us, and the DFT, in its most recent document, which is a local authority toolkit, also says walking and cycling are the least carbon-intensive ways to travel. And even if you're going to make all of the cars, public transport, and HGV zero emission, that's great, but it's still not going to be enough to address the climate emergency. You're still going to have also all of the brakes and the tires, all of those emissions that are coming off the vehicles, that's all going to the ocean. There's still so much to address. We have to be doing more. And if you want some really sober reading, have a look at the IPCC assessment report. Again, they're highlighting that, yes, we need to transition away from internal combustion vehicles and fossil-fueled generating stations, but really we need policies and designs that facilitate active urban transport, so walking and cycling. Increasing efficiency in this sector is going to reduce emissions as well as improve air quality, and also those benefits of generating physical and mental health benefits for residents. That's me. Here's my resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Been making lots of notes. And finally, we have our third speaker, Sam Pooke. Sam is a public policy expert specialising in the UK transport sector. A senior policy manager for Voi, Sam leads a number of the company's initiatives to support the uptake of micromobility across UK towns and cities. Since launching in Northampton in September 2020, Voi has gone on to become the UK's largest micromobility operator, managing e-scooters and e-bike operations in 17 locations across the country. Sam, could you step over the weird board and join us? Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Sam Pooke. I'm Senior Policy Manager for Voi Technology in the UK. Before I start, I just want to say I couldn't agree more with everything you just went through then, Zoe. I'm going to touch on a lot of similar themes myself, and I particularly love the idea that city planning and urban design doesn't have to be revolutionary. It doesn't have to be the Jetsons. What cities should look like, we've actually seen a lot of it in the past. We can just make that more sustainable. I'm going to touch on a lot of that myself, but yeah, I just particularly love that idea. So yes, as Pippa mentioned, I'm Senior Policy Manager for Voi Technology. We are an e-scooter firm in the UK, and as I'm sure many of you will have seen, we run the e-scooters in Bristol, so the Coral scooters. I just want to do my own straw poll, so as a key room before, can anyone put their hand up who has ridden a Voi e-scooter in Bristol? About 3/4, brilliant. Hopefully that means everyone's going to agree with what I'm about to say. So I'm here today as part of this conference, particularly to talk about urban transport and what that means for the future of our cities. And I want to start with just a really simple question, which is, why is urban transport central to the fight against climate change? And the answer is this. Despite the fact that cities only make up 1% of the Earth's surface, we currently house 55% of the global population in our cities. And those cities contribute 75% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So the proportion of the world's population is over proportionally focused in our cities, and that's only going to get worse, because whereas it's currently 55%, that number is due to be 70% by 2050. So in 30 years' time, 70% of the world's population is going to live on roughly 1% of the Earth's surface. So we've got to this point where we have this incredible number of people housed in just a very, very tiny part of the planet's surface. And obviously this creates a dilemma of all these people obviously need a way to get from where they are to where they're going. And if we can look at the rise of cars and the fall of tram systems in the UK, and for any other transport nerds in the room, this is a very sad graph. The first electric tram service opened in the UK in 1901. It went from Shepherd's Bush to Kew Gardens in London. By the 1930s, where we see the top of the red line, there were over 14,000 different tram services across the UK. But sadly, we can see quite clearly how these tram services have declined, and how sort of shortly in that very close to pre-war era, all of our trams started to disappear. And we've clearly sleepwalked into a period where the car is king, the car is in charge. What I want to explore is why. How have we allowed ourselves to get to this point where we had at one point 14,000 tram services in the UK, where we had such protected open city spaces, which Zoe was showing us before. So we've now got to the point where we are obsessed with cars. We're obsessed with not just owning a car and driving one, but designing our cities based on how well a car will fare. In the late 19th century, cars were invented. They became a key force of change in the early 20th century, and they were introduced and they were promised as a way of getting us from where we are to where we need to go to faster. Simple as that. And it worked. They did get us to where we need to go faster. But we've allowed them to take over. They no longer save us. They're no longer a product which serve us for our purpose. They now dominate our city planning. When we're allocating road space, when we're planning journeys, it's all based around the car. And I think we need to change that. I don't think anyone in this room would disagree with the idea that cities across Europe, and particularly in the UK, have a car problem. If we just look at some of the numbers on screen, a quarter of the world's CO2 emissions come from the transport industry, and just under half of those emissions come from road transport alone. This next number is particularly scary. 90% of people who live in cities in Europe are exposed to unsafe levels of air pollution every single day, according to research from the EEA. So if you live in a city in Europe, as I'm sure most of us do, there is a 90% chance that you're being exposed to unsafe levels of air pollution every single day. And it's only getting worse, because congestion is growing. Latest figures show that a UK driver will spend 178 hours on average a year stuck in traffic. 178 hours equates to 7.4 days. So over a week every year we are spending sitting in a car. And to touch on inequality as well, to carry on from some of the themes that Zoe raised, it's getting worse. Because people on low income are being disproportionately affected by the car problem. They're being disproportionately exposed to the burdens of car-centric mobility. So we've now got to a point where we are travelling around in big diesel or petrol guzzling 2-ton metal boxes. And what's worse is that we're not even doing it efficiently. We're moving around in these vehicles alone. More than 50% of all car trips in the UK are made by only one passenger. 60% of those trips are less than 3 miles. So we're not even doing it efficiently. We're travelling by ourselves, we're not making space, we're not making use of the space of the vehicles, we're not going very far. And privately owned cars are staying stationary for 95% of the time. 95%. So we're at this point where not only have we allowed cars to take over our cities, to take over our space, to pose such a significant threat to the planet, but they're doing it whilst being idle 95% of the time. They're doing it whilst laughing at us. They're only doing it with just being used at 5% of the time. Now, this is an image which I'm sure many people, particularly those who are into city planning, urban planning, will have seen before. It's by a Swedish artist called Carl Gilg, and it was commissioned a number of years ago by the Swedish Road Authority. And it shows how we live today. It shows what our cities are like. We are at a point now where pedestrians are marginalised to narrow pavements and crossings and not daring to take up this great big chasm of space that we have, which we're allowing to be used for roads and cars. Up to 50% of urban space is allocated to car parking and roads, and we've become blind to it. This is seen as the default, this is seen as acceptable. And what we have had in the past with such large protected open spaces, as we saw before in Zoe's presentation, has been sleepwalked into this. This is seen as the norm. However, it's not all doom and gloom. And this is where micromobility comes in. Pippa mentioned earlier, and Dr. Kieran mentioned earlier as well, about how the west of England and Bristol in particular has become Voi's largest market. And it is. That's not just for the UK, that's for Europe. So now in over 80 cities across Europe that Voi has services, Bristol is our most popular. Now, not many people may know this, but we were originally introduced in the UK to provide an easing of pressure for public transport. Micromobility, so the use of shared e-bikes or shared e-scooters, is a first last mile solution. We are there to complement public transport. However, because we were brought in during the pandemic in the UK, we had to take the pressure off because of reduced capacity. So it was a bit of a unique position. However, the e-scooter market in the UK, and particularly here in the west of England, has gone from strength to strength. And I just want to highlight some of our particularly impressive numbers, just to show off a bit. And more for our Bristol and Don to show off a bit. Since we launched in October in 2020, over 4 million trips have been completed on e-scooters in Bristol. We have 250,000 users in the city, and with our modal shift rate of cars and taxis, we've replaced over 1.5 million car trips in the city. So in just under 18 months, 1.5 million car trips have been replaced thanks to e-scooters. The distance travelled has been 11 million kilometres, which for those interested is 28 times to the moon and back. So well done, Bristolians. 370,000 litres of gasoline has been saved, and 430 tonnes of CO2 has been saved from entering the atmosphere because of car trips that haven't taken place because someone has chosen to take an e-scooter instead. And what we're trying to see here is that there is a way out. There is demand for alternatives. Whereas we've spent the past 80, 90 years focused on cars and designing our cities around cars, we are getting to a point now where people are prioritising more sustainable modes. People take sustainability into their consumer choices more than they ever have in history, and we're seeing that in transport. And what's been particularly helpful in turning Bristol into what we'd call, the jewel in our crown across the UK and Europe is the ambition that we've seen from Bristol Council. And there's been some particularly positive comments from the mayor.
We're in an age now where we need what we call sustainable urbanisation. Things like Voi scooters, cycling, walking, these are all going to be planned into the future of urbanisation in UK cities. It's exciting, it's dynamic, it's open, it's incredibly convenient. It's had a massive impact on the city, which is translated into replacing short car journeys. It's a sign that people in the west of England are really picking up this as a mode of transport. Now it's become a habit. This is now a norm.
Having that type of support from the council has been brilliant in helping us to move forward, because we can't do this alone. It's not about one company, what we can achieve. It's not even about what one council can achieve. It's not about what Sustrans or Design West can do together. Getting to a point where we are more sustainable can only be done if everyone works together, if we have these shared ambitions. We could roll out an e-scooter service in the city and have 10 million rides, but if not one of them replaces a car journey, then there's no point. Because what I want to talk about is how our cities could look. And just to finish on a bit more of a positive note than some of the doom and gloom stats. So this is an area in Liverpool called Lark Lane. And what strikes out at me is that despite the fact it's quite narrow, the majority of space is given to a road. And what's even worse is that protective bollards have to be put up to protect people from the cars. Now, I would think it would look a lot better if the space was used for this. You've still got that open space where people can travel in and out of the area, but using sustainable modes of transport. So using scooters, using bikes. You've got a lot more access for pedestrians, for children, for people with disabilities as well. Because I think having a disability doesn't make you vulnerable. It's the conditions around that create the vulnerability. And we, as the private sector and as policymakers, have a responsibility to make sure that that vulnerability is taken away. And the use of city space is a big part of that. And just to finish with a couple more positive examples, similarly in Marseille, to most people, a normal looking road by many standards, probably quite a good road, but space could still be used better. You still have space for public transport. We're not trying to take away all roads. People still have need for cars, but not for those short journeys. The point we're trying to underline is that there is a better way to use space, and using that space in an improved way creates better habits, it creates better behaviours. And finally, with an example from Copenhagen, in what is quite a wide space, about 80% of that is road. Half of it's parking on both sides, and then half of that is road. Despite the fact there's clearly apartments, there's clearly people who live there. And I think the point we're just trying to finish on here is that space is important, design is important, and I think we all need to work together to make a better use of this space, because it can't be done alone. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
I'd like to ask the speakers to join me at the front here. We're also going to be joined by Councillor Donald Alexander. Don is the Bristol City Council Labour and Co-op Councillor for Avonmouth and Lawrence Weston ward since 2016, and the Cabinet Member for Transport since June 2021, so quite new in post. Okay, I'm going to kick off with some questions, but then hand over to the audience. Thank you all for fascinating talks, giving us a really great overview of what's happening, what has been happening. I'm just going to kick off with a little provocation here. It's sort of directed at Sam, but also Kieran and Don. Zoe, you're blameless. I wondered whether Voi's success is in part because the public transport in Bristol is so bad. Who would like to take that up? Don.
Yes, I think it is partly. But interestingly, of course, it has mainly been in the centre of Bristol, which is where the public transport is probably at its most intense, if you like that. It'd be quite interesting to see now it's extending, Sam's extending things out to my area of the city, Avonmouth, Lawrence Weston, Southmead, Southmead, Henbury, but also to the south of the city, to see what the take-up is around there as well. But yeah, to a certain extent, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think one of the benefits of e-scooters is the ease with which you can access them. And I think if accessing an e-scooter is a lot easier than other modes of transport, then people are going to go for it. And I think that's a good thing. One of the most important factors in trying to get people to leave cars behind is giving them as many options as possible. If it's just between a car or a bus, which only runs every half hour, and you're, at best a 50-minute walk away from the station, people are going to use their car, and we can't blame them for that. So what we have to do is give people as many options as possible. And I think that's where e-scooters come in, because if there are a lot of people who can't rely on public transport for whatever reason, then having ease of access to a net zero mode of transport is positive.
Great. Kieran.
Yeah, I think the e-scooters have attracted a particular demographic, not entirely, but to quite a large extent, young people, and it's it's filled a gap. I think. I don't think it's replacing, but entirely. I think some of that group are not happy with buses, but they're looking for a mobility, a cleaner mobility option. It's partly, I think it's partly that, but it's partly that the young people are looking for an agile, sexy, cleaner emissions-wise alternatives. So I think we need to partly pay. I think there is a really, as I was saying, really important that we look to revive buses and make them better, faster, more reliable, and perhaps fight back a bit against the e-scooters amongst that age group. But I still think e-scooters are filling a gap as well in a helpful way.
Yeah, we saw some figures in your presentation, Kieran, that, and I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm getting these points out here, that the majority of users are young and male. Zoe, do you have any thoughts on this? I'm sure you do.
I do have some thoughts on this. I don't know what the data is actually. I would love to know a bit more about the breakdown of gender. Because I think, like for example, we know that women don't feel comfortable walking around at night, and is it possible that voice scooters or any e-scooter could fill a bit of that gap? But I also think about, I haven't used a scooter, and think sometimes I've either got my rucksack or a bag, where am I going to put that bag? Thinking about designing things for women who often are doing that trip chaining and I got to pop by the shops. If I need to pick something up, is the e-scooter functional for that?
Yeah. Well, our e-scooters in Bristol do have a hook on for your bag, so you've got no excuse. But yeah, so when it comes to gender breakdown, e-scooters tend to mirror cycling almost identical. It is mostly men, and it is mostly younger men. And I think young men tend to be at the forefront, or well, forefront sounds negative, but tend to be the first ones to try the types of disruptive elements of different things. We are conducting a piece of research which is going to be published soon to find out exactly why a lot fewer women ride e-scooters, and the initial findings of that are very similar to cycling. It's safety in terms of road safety, so being exposed to the elements that's exposed to drivers, and then personal safety as well, in the sense that because there is a process you have to go through for hiring and ending your ride, you are stationary for 15 to 20 seconds, and therefore that creates a sense of vulnerability, but that is therefore on us and the council to work together to find a solution to that. So one thing we're looking at is, can we ensure that our parking spots are in well-lit areas, for example, just to make it a lot easier for women to take away, as I say, that vulnerability. But at the moment, does tend to be younger men who ride, as with cycling, but that is something we're trying to change.
I think the figure's slightly more positive in terms, slightly more balanced than it is for cycling actually in Bristol. 64% men, 36, a slightly better ratio than it is for cycling actually. But we haven't really got much in the public domain in terms of proper information, and this isn't down to Voy very much. If anything, DFT's national, they're doing a national study evaluation of all the trials. There's nothing in the public domain. There is a report, it hasn't been published. I don't know why, there's some sensitivities, but it started when mid-2020 or late 2020, we're over a year, and this isn't really, it's not really good enough that quite a major, especially in this area, such a major contribution to mobility, and there isn't any information out there, and that's down to more the government authorities than it is to Voy. So how can the public just understand, make their own interpretation on the safety side? So we're helping WECA evaluate with Voy the scheme in the west of England, and the safety is a key area. Not many e-scooter collisions are appearing in the police data, the standard source of data, but hospital records are showing about one a day in the Bristol, two main Bristol hospitals. Person attending the hospital with some injury. So that is quite a serious issue, and I know we're doing a lot to improve the safety, and it's not there down to Voy about helmet wearing, but the medics are really concerned about the helmet wearing issue and scooters. And scooters have different issues than cycling in terms of their whole physics of riding an e-scooter.
Okay, thank you. I've got a whole list of questions, but I can see there are people in the audience who want to ask a question. So we have a roving mic. Please hold it close to ask your question.
Yes, good evening. My name's Peter Lang. It's a question mostly for Sam, but also I just want to throw an idea out just to see reactions from maybe all the panel. So every transport mode that's been invented has always started being open to the elements. The early trains, the early cars, the trams, lorries, buses. The ones that haven't so far, of course, is bicycles. They're still open to the elements. No one really seems to be making much of an attempt to change that. My question is about voice scooters. Are there plans to try and make them basically a bit bigger and therefore a bit more stable, and therefore also possible to have a roof inside, which basically means that they've been contracted to use through the sort of 3-4 months of the year where in this country the weather is not that good. And also, I'm glad the issue of bags has been raised, because the difficulty in carrying any luggage on it seems to be quite serious, and that would be something we're looking at. So that's the view. The proposal for the rest of you is we have a film office in Bristol which facilitates film companies coming here wanting to make films, and I believe it's very successful. What would your thoughts be about having an experimental transport office here, which is basically doing the transport, to try to encourage people to come here and experiment with their transport ideas, and that would be vehicles, but also highway design, because it seems that the voice scooter is the first time we've actually had any real experiment in transport. I think since minicabs arrived in 1959. So there's an idea for you, which I'm just interested in your reactions to.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I think this is sounding like a sexy mobility scooter that you're describing here, and I'm up for that. That sounds great.
Yeah,
Any plans for that?
It sounds a bit like a scooter version of the Pooke mobile, isn't it?
Yeah.
So at the moment we don't have plans for that, but we will have a new version of our scooter in Bristol in the coming months, which is going to be slightly bigger, slightly more robust as well. So I'd say keep an eye out for that. And I'll pass over to the people on the panel, but I love the idea of an experimental transport office. I think that sounds fantastic.
Don, could we make that happen? Kieran, Don, Zoe, you be the people. With us, of course.
WECA is a transport authority, and WECA has already got something called Future Zone, which instigated the trial of Voy. And, not everyone is a fan of experimental transport things. You get a lot of emails from people that sort of, what have you let loose on us, and what were you a test bed for? This kind of, flying machines and whatever. So, but yes, we are a test bed for it, actually, because not every city has got Voy or any things. But sorry, excuse me. There is a whole range of vehicles, powered light vehicles. So go through from the electric scooter, electric motorbikes, through to tiny cars. And there's even a sort of professional trade organisation that writes them in as a conference on these things, and it is lobbying for legislation and for standards to bring in, because what they're saying is, rather than, we need to choose the vehicle that we need for the purpose that we're doing, rather than just getting a car. Why not have a very tiny car? If you don't need to transport other people, have a really tiny car. Why not have a electric motorbike to do something that we normally use another kind of vehicle for? So start with the smallest kind of thing that you need. Then you're more likely to be able to electrify it. And then that's one way of doing it, rather than just taking your average vehicle and then saying, let's shove a motor and a load of batteries to cart it around. Really heavy vehicle with vastly more electric on it, vastly more metal on it than you actually need. Just take a different approach to vehicles.
I'd love to see more experimentation in the transport sector and also in the design, element of the way that our city exists. But I think Don's point about getting those angry emails, it's really important that any kind of experimental project or office or whatever would actually involve local residents, and it could be a co-design process so that people could get involved, and it wouldn't just be something that's imposed, but actually people locally saying, oh, well, why don't we try this out? Why don't we try out some of those amazing visualizations that you had of what neighborhoods could look like in different cities? You know, try those things out for a while, but get the people in the neighborhoods involved in the process as opposed to just plunking something in.
Great. Kieran?
I would advocate something different, which is experimental setting for the infrastructure in the streets. Well, I think Zoe was getting to, partly in line with Zoe there, I think. So I think there's more value to be done from that. Bristol does have a bit of a tradition of that with play streets and home zones and other things. Dutch-style cycleway nearby to us here. There's so many more opportunities than that, though. I've just come back from the Netherlands, and they're just taking things a step. Every time I go there, they're taking things further there in their amazing infrastructure, particularly for cycling, but even for public transport as well. So we ought to be looking at those and trying those out here, and then if we have the right, better infrastructure for cycling, then there's a wide variety of cycle designs that we don't see in our streets that are ripe for those really as well. So I don't think we need to get fixated about motorised electric vehicle technology.
Great. I was thinking there's one place you could impose it, and that would be a new development. And I think he's just left, but we had Seb Loyne in the audience from YTL, who's working on the Brabazon neighbourhood, which is actually in South Gloucestershire, isn't it? And that is when we build these new areas, I think it would be fascinating to kind of really embed this kind of sustainable travel, and then maybe bring people there to look at what it feels like, because much as I'd love to take the whole population of Bristol to the Netherlands or to a fantastic French city, that's quite difficult, but maybe South Gloucestershire is a bit easier. Yeah.
To a certain extent, we do that because, I mean, I was chair of planning in a previous life, and we have to work with the developer, and there are constraints on what we can demand from them, and we have policies that we take to the developer, and there's a bit of backwards and forwards. So we can't impose anything on the development unless it's all our own council development. But for instance, what we're proposing in South Gloucestershire, Cribbs Patchway New Network, there are 2 stations within that and a metro bus route, and the cycle lanes will be built into it. The problem is now in these old places like the centre of Bristol, where you've got a certain number of feet of road and you have to divide it up between the different modes, and of course, you know, people who are into transport tend to be into a mode, and so they start then arguing between each other, and eventually someone drives a car through the lot of them. So, you know, to work together on these things.
Definitely. Although I think you did very well many years ago with Queen Square in reducing the car dominance there.
And our proposals for Park Street and the Triangle and stuff and White Ladies Road are pretty ambitious. We could have done more, but chances perhaps are that you'd fail on the whole lot. So work slowly, carefully.
Thanks. I saw another hand raised. Stripy t-shirt.
Thank you all for your presentations tonight. That was really interesting. My question is probably more about the perceptions of transport in this country, and unfortunately we seem to have quite a tribal nature in terms of cars and cyclists, and well, basically anyone who's going to get in the way of a car, essentially. How much do we see that as a threat going forward? I mean, there's some quite interesting stats about the disassociation between car and younger people and ownership, that sort of thing. Do you think this is something that could potentially be an opportunity going forward?
So, Kieran, do you think we're going to really shift that mode as the young generation comes forward?
Yeah, I think you're diagnosing things quite well really there. But I think how much is that a consequence of the systems we have, rather than what do we try and change first, the tribes themselves, the perceptions, or the system. So I think the sort of things that Don's just mentioned, if you can take forward things like Queen Square, can change people's mentality about the quality of city centre space. People might say the whole city centre should be car-free. Parts of it are. Perhaps can you move people along in that direction more now that there's been progress in that way? And with Brabazon development, if that does fulfil the hopes that were mentioned just then, can then set an example to change the mentalities more widely. But yeah, we do. I don't think they know if we start with a mentality shift or we're going to start with a system change. It's the dilemma.
Do both.
Both, definitely.
I think there's an issue just with that perception as well, that next month, Don, we've got the Walking and Cycling Index, which will be launched, which is Bristol, formerly the Bike Life document based on Copenhagen. But actually in that document, we've got data that's been independently collected about people's perceptions on walking and cycling, and actually in the previous years as well, there's usually quite a high appetite for changing the way that our streets are dominated by cars, for example, and increasing the amount of space for cycling and walking, even by people who do travel by car. But it's actually getting that information out, because I think it's quite easy to focus on some of those loud negative voices, but there's actually quite a lot of appetite for changing the way that we move around. We just need to be listening to all of the voices and not focusing on a few loud negative voices.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I think sometimes the reasons perceptions come about is because you tend to get the antis who tend to shout the loudest. As I'm sure Don will tell you, you must get very few emails emailing you how great the council is, and don't get a lot complaining, and I think it's the same with e-scooters.
The gentleman has suggested the transport, testing here and piloting of stuff. We never get anyone like you, sir, at full council.
Go to council, go on.
Go to full council, come to cabinet.
Nobody's ever done it. I've never heard there is something.
But nobody's ever said it in public.
I've noticed that you focused on the opposition, and there is something about car drivers in the psychology that they feel that they're almost imprisoned if they can't use their car or if they can't go somewhere with it. But my feeling is that what there is that there is a real desire from people for better transport in Bristol.
Yes.
That's what we're all agreeing about. And the sort of car drivers say, well, I won't go by a bus because the buses are so slow and they don't go the routes don't go where I want to. And I won't go by bike because it's so dangerous because there's so many cars, so I go by car. And it's clear that trying new ways of doing things, and it's road layouts, design, and it's also vehicles, all sorts, trying them out and let people see them and sample them. And so that's why I'm sort of, or maybe some sort of office which stimulates it. One of the things I do is I cycle a lot, but I work for a company building hydrogen cars, and we're basing them in a town where the local authority really wanted us to be and was so cooperative. And so in Bristol we may well find that we experiment with something and people like it, and then the economy benefits because somebody comes here and they might start making something that's not available anywhere else. And sort of bicycles with a roof is something nobody's ever done, and my feeling it would actually increase the popularity of them, particularly in the winter months.
Thank you. We have a question at the back here.
Hi, I had two questions really. Firstly, for the representative of the council. Since the COVID pandemic, we've gone to a system of putting these orange barriers or safety bollards along existing infrastructure. But do you think that is appropriate to really drive the use of voice scooters across the Bristol, where the actual carriageway has a lot of cracking, which is not sufficient to promote the use of these voice scooters. A lot of areas I don't think we use LTN 20 to the best way we can across Bristol. And the second question was for Representative Sam from Boy. In terms of your voice scooters, they obviously rechargeable batteries. Where is the electricity for your batteries coming from? Is that a renewable source? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I can answer that one quickly. Yes, so the way our batteries work is that they are swappable. So we have staff in the west of England who either drive around in electric vans or using cargo bikes, and all of our batteries are charged at our warehouse, which uses renewable energy, and then they take those charged batteries out to the scooters, and they know on their tablet which ones are at low levels, and then they simply swap them out, swap in for a new one, and then again either drive in an e-van or an e-cargo bike back to the warehouse and just recharge it with sustainable energy. And that's actually quite an important point, because I think you get a lot of companies who, especially nowadays, see sustainability as a PR opportunity, and a lot of people think because they have the letter A in front of their product, that means they're green and everything's fine. But I think it's really important that companies are able to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, and you need to have sustainable supply chains and sort of sustainable back ends to your product as well. So yes, it's all renewable energy, and more so it's transported to the scooters using sustainable vehicles as well.
Thank you. LTNs, Don.
Well, there's a couple of slightly different issues there. One is, so as a highways authority, we need to get legal permission. We need to take legal permission by certain routes in order to cone off parts of the highway, or even to put in double yellow lines. It's quite a protracted legal process you have to go through. During the pandemic, we were given special pandemic authorities, basically, to be able to put down these temporary cones. And we did it in many areas in order to create space for people with social distancing. Now, we've taken on those temporary things. The legislation has expired, and we've had to decide how to take on all those different schemes in the future. Some, one or two, I think Westbury Village, for instance, we've just taken out. It was never supported really by the local councillors or, frankly, the people there. Probably necessary during the pandemic because the pavement was narrow. And there are others such as Cottam Hill, where we've built on those now, and we're moving through the legal phases, which are very complex, involving consultation, because the highways actually, I think, belong to the Queen. We are just the custodian of these highways. We have a duty to keep them open rather than rather than them belonging to us as the Highways Authority. Princess Victoria Street and other areas like Park Row, we're kind of taking them out because we've got a bigger scheme going on. Similarly in Lewins Mead, so we had some really nasty temporary ones down there. The Triangle as well, we had some that were blowing around in the wind and First Bus weren't happy with them. In all those areas, we've used them, and we're trying to take on that and kind of transcend it really into something that is legally and is better quality. Regards LTN 120, it's forever quoted LTN 120. We only have a certain amount of space at the end of the day. We have to do several things. Not all our cycle provision is going to conform to LTN 120. It cannot do, otherwise we'll not have other things on there. That's just a reality of some of the roads. We can't rip out heritage walls. We can't rip out trees. We have to live with what we've got. So we do the absolute best, and if we're getting money from WECA or from Department of Transport, which we quite often are, they go through with a fine-tooth comb everything before they allow us to spend that money on that. And we do our best to do that for every mode of transport, the progressive, shall we say, the future of transport, not the history of transport.
And on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close. I'm so glad we ended with LTN 120. It sounds like a real transport talk. And also the fact that the Queen owns the highways. Who'd have thunk it? That's amazing. I'd like you to join me in thanking our speakers, Dr. Kiran Chatterjee, Don Alexander, Zoe Banks-Gross, and Sam